The whispers followed Amelia Blackwood like ghosts through the grand ballroom of the plaza. Each flicker of a crystal chandelier seemed to expose her. Every clink of a champagne flute sounded like a judgment. She was a wildflower in a meticulously cultivated hothouse of orchids, and she knew it. Her husband, Julian Blackwood, a man carved from generational wealth and corporate steel, had reminded her of that fact just moments before they'd stepped out of the Rolls-Royce. "For God's sake, Amelia," he'd hissed, his eyes flicking over her simple, elegant dress. "Try to look like you belong. This isn't one of your provincial art fairs." Now, standing under the weight of 1,000 judging eyes, she felt his words clinging to her skin, colder and heavier than the Cartier diamonds around her neck. But she had no idea that this night, her husband's casual cruelty was just the opening act for a public execution, and that a ghost from her own past was about to walk through the doors and burn his entire world to the ground. The Blackwood Annual Charity Gala was the crown jewel of the Manhattan social season. It wasn't just a party, it was a performance of power. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, vibrated with the low hum of influence. Here deals that would shape the skyline were made over canapes, and reputations were built or shattered with a single, well-placed whisper. Amelia clutched her small, beaded purse, the fabric a comforting anchor in a sea of glittering silk and unforgiving satin. 5 years of marriage to Julian Blackwood, and she still felt like an imposter. She had met him at a gallery opening where one of her landscape paintings was on display. He had been a whirlwind of charm and intoxicating confidence. He'd told her she was a breath of fresh air, a vibrant splash of authenticity in his monochrome world of trust funds and boardrooms. She, a quiet artist from upstate New York, who had built her own small success through talent and grit, had been swept away. The reality of their marriage, however, was less of a fairy tale and more of a meticulously curated exhibit. Julian loved the idea of her, the talented, earthy artist who made him seem more grounded. But he was constantly trying to sand down her edges to mold her into the perfect, silent and pedigreed accessory. He'd suggested she stop painting professionally. "It's a lovely hobby, darling, but it's not befitting the Blackwood name," and had replaced her comfortable, paint-splattered wardrobe with designer pieces that felt like costumes. Tonight's costume was a navy blue silk gown by a lesser-known, albeit brilliant designer she admired. It was understated elegant, and most importantly, it felt like her. But in this room, it was a whisper amidst shouts. All around her were the latest creations from Chanel, Dior, and Valentino, worn by women who had been born into this world. "Darling," Julian's voice, smooth as scotch, but with a bitter finish cut through her thoughts. He slipped an arm around her waist, his grip possessively tight. "The Rockefellers are here. Smile. And for heaven's sake, stand up straight. You look like you're waiting for a bus." She forced a smile, the muscles in her face feeling stiff. "I'm just a little overwhelmed, Julian. It's a lot." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Overwhelmed by what success? This is our life, Amelia. You'd do well to get used to it." He steered her towards an impeccably dressed older couple, his public smile a mask of practiced warmth. As Julian schmoozed, Amelia felt a presence slide up beside her. "Amelia, you look quaint." The voice belonged to Isabella Croft. Isabella was everything. Amelia was not tall, razor-thin, with an icy blonde beauty and an air of aristocratic boredom that she wielded like a weapon. She was a senior VP at a rival investment firm, but she and Julian moved in the same predatory circles. They claimed to be old family friends, but Amelia always felt a different, more charged energy between them. Isabella's eyes, the color of a winter sky, raked over Amelia's dress. "Did you design it yourself?" "It has a certain artisanal charm." The word artisanal was meant to be an insult, a synonym for unsophisticated. "I have great admiration for the designer," Amelia replied, keeping her voice even. "She values craftsmanship over brand names." Isabella's lips curved into a smirk. "How noble." "Julian, darling," she said, turning her attention fully to him and placing a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. "I need to steal you for a moment. Marcus Vanderbilt has a question about the Hong Kong merger. It's dreadfully important." Julian's eyes lit up. He glanced at Amelia, his expression a clear dismissal. "Of course. Amelia, can you manage on your own for a bit? Try not to talk about paint pigments or the beauty of a sunset with the senator." He winked at Isabella, sharing a private joke at his wife's expense. Amelia felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. She watched them walk away, a perfectly matched pair of predators, their heads bent close together in conspiracy. It wasn't just the casual dismissal that stung. It was the easy intimacy they shared, an intimacy Julian and she had never managed to achieve. She was his wife, but in rooms like this, she felt more like his dirty little secret, the middle-class girl he was trying desperately to polish into a diamond. She retreated to the edge of the room, finding refuge near a towering floral arrangement. From there, she had a perfect view of the spectacle. She saw Julian laughing with Isabella, his hand now resting on the small of her back. It was a gesture so natural, so possessive, that it made Amelia's breath catch in her throat. The whispers she'd imagined earlier suddenly felt very, very real. She wasn't just being paranoid. Something was happening right here in front of everyone, and she was the only one who seemed to be outside of the joke. The humiliation, when it began in earnest, was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, suffocating poison. It started with Julian forgetting to introduce her. As he moved through the room, a king holding court, he would greet titans of industry and their wives by name, sharing handshakes and air kisses. When their eyes fell on Amelia, standing silently by his side, he would offer a vague, "And this is my wife," before immediately redirecting the conversation back to billion-dollar valuations and summering in the Hamptons. Each omission was a small cut, leaving her feeling invisible, an unnamed appendage to his greatness, later gathered in a circle with some of the city's most powerful players, including the formidable Harrison Montgomery of Montgomery Corp. The conversation turned to a recent art auction. "Julian, I heard you acquired the new Rothko." Montgomery said, his voice a low rumble. "A bold move." "A necessary one," Julian replied, puffing out his chest. "Art is the ultimate currency of power. It requires a discerning eye, an understanding of legacy and value." He paused, then gestured dismissively towards Amelia. "My wife, on the other hand, prefers, what is it you called it, darling art with soul. She'd have us hang finger paintings in the penthouse if she had her way." The group chuckled politely. It was a joke, but the barb was aimed directly at her heart, at the one thing that was truly hers, her passion for art. He was mocking her taste, her identity, framing it as provincial and naive in front of people whose opinions could make or break careers. Amelia's cheeks burned. "I believe art should evoke emotion, not just reflect a stock portfolio," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Julian's smile tightened. "You see," he said to the group, his tone patronizing, "so much passion. It's what I found so refreshing, a delightful naivete. Isabella Croft, who had seamlessly integrated herself into their circle, chimed in her voice like cut glass. "Oh, I think it's sweet. But in this world, Julian sentimentality is a liability. You need a partner who understands the strategic value of a collection, not just the pretty colors." She looked from Julian to Amelia, a flicker of triumph in her cold eyes. She wasn't just commenting on art, she was making a pitch for herself. The conversation moved on, leaving Amelia stranded in a bubble of mortified silence. Julian didn't look at her, but she could feel his disapproval radiating off him like a cold front. He was punishing her for speaking up, for having an opinion that wasn't a mirror of his own. The true crescendo of his cruelty came near the presentation stage. Julian was one of the evening's hosts and was scheduled to give a speech. As guests began to take their seats at the lavishly decorated tables, he pulled her aside, his fingers digging into her arm. "What was that back there?" He seethed, his voice a venomous whisper. "Contradicting me in front of Montgomery. Do you have any idea how foolish you made me look?" "I was just expressing my opinion, Julian," she whispered back, trying to pull her arm away. "Your opinion," he sneered. "Your opinion is worthless in this room. Your job is to look beautiful, smile, and agree with me. That's the deal. A deal, I might add, that has afforded you a life you couldn't have even dreamed of. That simple dress you're so proud of probably cost more than your father makes in a month." The mention of her father was a low blow. He knew how much she adored her dad, a retired history professor who valued books over bank accounts and integrity over influence. It was a world Julian couldn't comprehend, so he belittled it. "Don't you dare talk about my father," she said, her voice shaking with a sudden surge of anger. "Oh, I'll talk about whatever I want," he said, his face inches from hers, his charming public mask completely gone. "You are my wife, and you will remember your place." He then released her arm, abruptly turned and walked towards the stage, his composure instantly restored. As he stepped into the spotlight, the applause was thunderous. Amelia stood frozen, the warmth of the room turning icy cold. She looked around and saw Isabella, standing a few feet away, watching her. Isabella hadn't heard the words, but she saw the aftermath in Amelia's stricken expression. A slow, cruel smile spread across Isabella's face. She lifted her champagne flute in a small, mocking toast to Amelia. At that moment, Amelia understood. This wasn't just Julian being a brute. This was a coordinated attack, a public dismantling of her worth, orchestrated by her husband and his mistress. They weren't just having an affair. They were trying to erase her, to break her down so completely that when Julian finally decided to cast her aside, no one would question it. They would simply remember the awkward, unsophisticated wife who never quite fit in. The room started to spin the applause for her husband, sounding like a death knell. Amelia had to get out. The air in the ballroom was suddenly too thin, the weight of 1,000 pairs of eyes pressing down on her. Julian was on stage now, his voice resonating through the speakers, talking about philanthropy and legacy, words that sounded like ash in her mouth. She felt a wave of nausea and dizziness, a physical revulsion to the hypocrisy of it all. Excusing herself from the table with a mumbled apology to the couple seated next to her, she fled. She didn't head for the powder room, knowing it would be filled with the very women whose pitying or scornful glances she was trying to escape. Instead, she found a side door she'd noticed earlier, one that led to a small, private stone balcony. The cool night air was a shock to her heated skin. It smelled of city rain and distant exhaust fumes, a welcome dose of reality after the perfumed prison of the gala. Leaning against the cold balustrade, she looked out over the glittering expanse of Central Park. The city lights, usually a source of wonder, seemed mocking tonight, like a million unblinking eyes. She finally allowed the tears she'd been holding back to fall. They streamed down her face, silent and hot. They were tears of humiliation, of anger, but mostly of a profound and soul-crushing loneliness. She had given up so much for Julian. She had left her small town, her close-knit circle of friends, her burgeoning career as an artist. She had quieted her own voice, dulled her own colors, all in an attempt to fit into his world, to be the wife he wanted. And for what? To be publicly shamed, to be treated as less than nothing, to be made a fool of by him and his mistress. Her mind drifted back to a conversation she'd had with her father, Arthur Sterling, just a few weeks ago. "Are you happy, Mia?" he had asked, his voice gentle over the phone. He never called her Amelia. To him, she was always Mia. "Of course, Dad." She had lied, the practiced cheerfulness of her voice, feeling like a betrayal. "Julian's work is going so well, and the new apartment is beautiful." There was a pause on the line. Her father was a quiet man, but he saw things others missed. He was a man who had built a small, successful consulting firm from the ground up through sheer intellect and integrity. He was unimpressed by the flash and bluster of men like Julian Blackwood. "That's his life, Mia. I asked about yours." He had pressed softly. "Are you still painting?" "When I have time," she hedged. The truth was, she hadn't touched a canvas in over a year. The studio Julian had built for her in their penthouse felt more like a mausoleum for her old self than a creative space. "Make time," he had said, his voice firm but kind. "Don't ever let anyone, not even the man you love, take away the thing that makes you you. That's the part of you that's priceless." Leaning there on the balcony, his words echoed in her mind. Priceless. Julian had just put a price tag on everything: her dress, her father's salary, her very worth, and found it all wanting. She had let him. She had stood by silently, while he stripped away her identity layer by layer, leaving this hollowed-out shell of a woman who wept on balconies at fancy parties. A new feeling began to bubble up through the grief, a cold, hard knot of fury. Fury at Julian for his cruelty. Fury at Isabella for her smug complicity. But most of all, fury at herself for letting it happen, for trading her own vibrant, authentic self for a life in a gilded cage. She wiped her tears away with the back of her hand, her movements suddenly decisive. No more. She would not let them break her. She didn't know how, but she was going to find her way back to the woman her father had raised her to be. She took one last deep breath of the cool night air, squaring her shoulders. She would go back inside, find Julian, and tell him she was leaving. Not tomorrow, not after a carefully worded discussion with lawyers. Tonight, she would walk out of this party and never look back. With this newfound resolve solidifying in her chest, she turned and pushed the door open, stepping back into the fray. But the scene she walked into was far worse than the one she had left. Julian had finished his speech and stepped down from the stage. The band had started playing a slow, jazzy tune. And there, in the center of a small, cleared space on the dance floor, was Julian. He was slow dancing with Isabella Croft. His hand was splayed possessively on the small of her back. Her arms were wrapped around his neck, and their heads were bent so closely together that their cheeks were almost touching. They were whispering, and Isabella laughed, a throaty, intimate sound that tore through Amelia. It was no longer an affair hidden in coded language and subtle touches. It was a declaration. They were dancing in the ashes of her marriage in front of the entire New York elite. Everyone was watching. Some were whispering behind their hands. Others were looking away in feigned ignorance. But they all saw it. They all saw the wife Amelia standing alone by the door, watching her husband embrace another woman. The humiliation was now absolute, a spotlight pinning her in place. Her resolve to confront him privately shattered. What was there left to say? He had said it all without uttering a single word to her. Just as Amelia felt the last of her strength begin to crumble, a subtle shift occurred at the grand entrance of the ballroom. It wasn't a loud commotion, but a palpable change in the atmosphere, a ripple that started with the security guards and spread inward. Two of the imposing earpiece-wearing men who had been flanking the doors suddenly stood straighter, their expressions shifting from bored professionalism to sharp, respectful attention. A man stepped through the archway. He was not young, perhaps in his late 60s, with a full head of silver hair and a face etched with the kind of lines that bespoke intelligence and authority rather than age. He wasn't dressed as ostentatiously as the other men in the room. His suit was a simple, impeccably tailored charcoal grey, likely from Savile Row, but it bore no flashy labels. He wore no diamond cufflinks or a Patek Philippe watch. His power wasn't something he wore. It was something he was. It radiated from him a quiet, unshakable confidence that made heads turn. People didn't know who he was, but they knew he was someone. The gala's host, a flustered socialite named Beatrice, hurried over to him, her face a mask of confusion and concern. "Sir, I'm sorry this is a private event. Perhaps you're mistaken." The man simply handed her a plain white card. Beatrice glanced at it, and the color drained from her face. She looked up at him, her jaw slack with shock and a newfound deference. "Mr. Sterling," she stammered, "of course, my apologies. We weren't expecting you. Please come in. Can I get you a drink?" "That won't be necessary," the man said, his voice calm and measured, yet carrying an authority that cut through the nearby chatter. His eyes, a piercing shade of blue, scanned the room, not with curiosity, but with a clear, defined purpose. They swept past the glittering chandeliers, the groaning buffet tables, and the clusters of gossiping guests. Julian and Isabella, still wrapped in their brazen embrace on the dance floor, had noticed the disturbance. Julian, ever the opportunist, saw the deference being shown to the newcomer and immediately smelled money and influence. He disentangled himself from Isabella, smoothing down his tuxedo. "Who is that?" he murmured to her, his eyes narrowed. "I don't recognize him, but look at how Beatrice is fawning over him. He must be significant." "Sterling?" Isabella whispered back, a flicker of uncertainty in her own eyes. "I know a Sterling group in London, a private equity behemoth. Very low profile, almost mythical. They say the man who runs it is a ghost. It couldn't be him. Whoever he is, I need to know him." Julian decided, his predatory instincts kicking in. He saw the man as a new target, a potential investor to be conquered. This was his world, his party, and this mysterious new power player had just walked into his domain. He began to move towards the entrance, ready to deploy the full force of his practiced charm. Amelia watched all of this from her frozen position by the balcony door. But she wasn't watching the host or Julian. She was watching the man. Her heart, which she thought had been shattered into a million pieces, gave a painful lurch, not of fear, but of disbelief. The blood drained from her own face, and for a moment the room tilted on its axis. Because she knew this man. She knew the quiet set of his shoulders, the determined line of his jaw, the intelligent calm in his piercing blue eyes. It was her father, Arthur Sterling, the quiet, retired history professor who loved books and peaceful walks in the woods. Except apparently that wasn't the whole story. The man who had just silenced the most powerful room in New York City with his mere presence was the same man who used to read her bedtime stories and help her with her history homework. She felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if her entire life had been a lie. Why was he here? And who exactly was he? Her father's eyes finally found her across the crowded room. His gaze softened instantly, the hard edge of authority melting away, to be replaced by a look of profound love and heart-wrenching concern. He saw her tear-streaked face, her trembling hands, her utter devastation. And in that moment, his expression hardened again. But this time, it wasn't the dispassionate look of a businessman. It was the focused, righteous fury of a father who had just seen his child in pain. He ignored the fawning host and the approaching Julian Blackwood. He began to walk his path, straight and deliberate, cutting a clear line through the sea of A-listers. His destination was not the bar, not the stage, not the most powerful CEO in the room. His destination was his daughter. The ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath as Arthur Sterling moved. The music faltered and then stopped as the band, sensing the seismic shift in the room's energy, trailed off into silence. The path cleared before him as if by an invisible force. People stepped back, their curiosity piqued, sensing that the real drama of the evening was about to unfold. Julian, seeing the formidable stranger heading in his general direction, puffed up his chest and put on his most welcoming smile. He intercepted Arthur just as he was a few feet from Amelia. "Good evening, sir." Julian began, extending a hand. "Julian Blackwood, a pleasure to welcome you to our gala. I don't believe we've had the pleasure of being introduced." Arthur Sterling stopped. He looked at Julian's outstretched hand for a long moment, making no move to take it. Then his cold blue eyes lifted to meet Julian's. He said nothing. The silence stretched thick and uncomfortable. Julian's smile began to falter, his hand dropping awkwardly to his side. He was a man used to commanding every room he entered, and this silent, absolute dismissal was more unnerving than any verbal slight. Ignoring Julian as if he were a piece of furniture. Arthur continued those final few steps until he was standing in front of Amelia. His stern, powerful demeanor vanished, replaced by the gentle concern of a father. "Mia," he said softly, his voice full of a warmth that no one else in the room had heard. He reached out and gently brushed a stray tear from her cheek with his thumb. "I came as soon as I heard. Are you all right?" Amelia could only nod, a fresh wave of tears blurring her vision. The sight of him, the familiar, loving use of her childhood nickname, was an anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Julian's face, which had been confused, now contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He stared at the powerful stranger, then at his provincial wife, the cogs in his brilliant, calculating mind grinding to a halt. It was impossible. This couldn't be the retired professor, the man he had so casually mocked not an hour before. "Dad, The word came out as a choked whisper from Amelia's lips. "What are you doing here? Who are you?" Arthur gave her a sad, gentle smile. "I'm who I've always been. Mia. I'm your father. There are just a few things I never burdened you with." He then turned his gaze back to Julian, and the icy authority slammed back into place like a vault door. "You." Arthur said, his voice quiet, but carrying the unmistakable crackle of command. "You are Julian Blackwood." It wasn't a question. It was an indictment. Julian, struggling to regain his composure, forced a laugh. Yes, I am. It seems there's been some sort of misunderstanding. Amelia, darling, you never told me your father was so well connected." He tried to put his arm around Amelia, to reclaim possession of her, but Arthur took a subtle step forward, blocking him. "My daughter told me you were a man of ambition." Arthur continued, his voice dangerously level. "She told me you were charming. She neglected to mention you were a fool." Isabella Croft, who had been watching from a few feet away with a growing sense of dread, now chose to intervene. She glided forward, attempting to de-escalate to regain control. "Mr. Sterling, is it?" she said, her voice a silken purr. "I'm Isabella Croft. There seems to be some tension here. Perhaps we can all discuss this privately." Arthur's gaze flicked to her, and it was even colder than the one he'd given Julian. "Miss Croft, I know exactly who you are, and we will be discussing your position publicly." The directness of the threat stunned Isabella into silence. Her carefully constructed facade of cool indifference finally cracked, revealing a flicker of raw panic. Arthur turned his full attention back to his son-in-law. "Julian, 5 years ago, your company Blackwood Industries was on the verge of bankruptcy. You were over-leveraged, your expansion into Asia was a disaster, and your creditors were ready to gut the company for parts. Then a mysterious, anonymous bailout came through a Swiss holding company. An injection of $300 million with subsequent investments totaling nearly $1 billion over the next 3 years. No strings attached, just a controlling interest held by a silent partner you never met." Julian's face had gone from shocked to ghostly white. He was staring at Arthur Sterling as if seeing a phantom. He knew the story better than anyone. That anonymous investment had been the miracle that saved him the foundation upon which he had built his current empire. He had spent years trying to identify the benefactor, to no avail. "You were told the money came from the Sterling Fund," Arthur said, his voice dropping each word a hammer blow. "You assumed it was a coincidence of names. You never once stopped to consider, did you? You were so busy mocking my daughter's simple upbringing, belittling her family, that you never thought to ask the name of her father." He paused, letting the full weight of the revelation settle not just on Julian, but on the entire, silent, captivated audience. "I am Arthur Sterling," he announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "And the Sterling Fund is me. I am your silent partner. I am the man who owns you." The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. It was so profound that the faint hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Julian Blackwood stood as if turned to stone, his face a ghastly shade of pale. The man he had ridiculed, the father of the woman he had publicly humiliated, was the architect of his success, the invisible hand that held the strings of his entire corporate empire. It was a twist so cruel, so perfectly ironic, that it belonged in a Greek tragedy. Arthur Sterling let the moment hang in the air, a master of psychological warfare. He had not raised his voice. He had not made a scene. He had simply stated facts, and in doing so had systematically dismantled Julian's world in front of his peers. "You built your kingdom on my money." Arthur continued, his voice a low, chilling monotone. "Money I invested, not because I believed in your reckless ambition, but because my daughter said she loved you. I wanted her to be happy and secure. I funded your life, your penthouse, your cars, this very party. I trusted you with my greatest treasure." He took a step closer, and for the first time Julian flinched, taking an involuntary step back. "And you?" Arthur's voice dripped with contempt. "Repaid that trust by trying to break her spirit, by flaunting your infidelity in her face. You thought her kindness was a weakness. You thought my silence was absent. You were wrong on both counts." He then turned his devastatingly calm gaze upon Isabella Croft, who looked as if she wanted to the marble floor to swallow her whole. "Ms. Croft," he said, "while my son-in-law was distracted by your charms, you've been quite busy. You thought you were playing him, didn't you?" Isabella opened her mouth to speak, to deny, to salvage something, but Arthur cut her off. "Let me be specific. For the last 18 months, you have been systematically leaking proprietary data from Blackwood Industries to your employers at Morgan & Chase Investments. Specifically, you've been feeding them Julian's acquisition strategies and quarterly projections, allowing them to consistently undercut his bids and anticipate his market moves." Julian's head whipped around to stare at Isabella. His shock now mingled with dawning, horrified comprehension. He thought of the deals that had mysteriously fallen through the rivals who had always seemed one step ahead. He had chalked it up to bad luck, to an internal leak he could never find. He never once suspected the woman in his bed. How could you know that?" Isabella stammered, her voice thin and reedy. Arthur's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. "Because, Ms. Croft, while you were busy trying to pick my son-in-law's pockets, my people were picking apart your life. I have copies of your encrypted emails to your boss, Marcus Thorne. I have records of the offshore payments made to a shell corporation in your name in the Cayman Islands. I have a sworn affidavit from the junior analyst you blackmailed into helping you. To be brief, I have a dossier on you that will not only end your career, but will very likely send you and Mr. Thorne to federal prison for corporate espionage and wire fraud." Isabella swayed on her feet, her face ashen. The hunter had just become the prey. She had thought she was manipulating a powerful man, only to discover she was a pawn in a much larger game played by a master she had never even seen. Finally, Arthur turned back to Julian for the final killing blow. "So you see, Julian, your grand betrayal is pathetically small in the grand scheme of things. You weren't just cheating on my daughter. You were being played for a fool by a corporate. You were so blinded by your own ego that you handed the keys to the kingdom to the enemy, all for a cheap thrill." He let the words sink in, a poison seeping into every corner of Julian's shattered pride. "The board of Blackwood Industries will be informed of this catastrophic security breach in the morning," Arthur stated calmly, "along with the fact that the Sterling Fund, which holds a 51% controlling interest in the company, has lost all faith in its CEO. I will be calling for an emergency vote to have you removed. Given that you have jeopardized the entire company and its shareholders, I expect the motion to pass unanimously." He looked around the room, his eyes meeting those of the powerful board members and investors who were scattered amongst the guests, all of whom were now looking at Julian, not with admiration, but with cold, calculating fury. "Your career is over. Your reputation is destroyed. You have lost your company, your mistress, and your wife in the span of 10 minutes. I hope for your sake it was worth it." With that, he turned his back on the broken man. He walked to Amelia, who had watched the entire exchange with disbelieving eyes. The woman who had fled to the balcony in tears was gone. In her place was a woman seeing her own strength reflected in her father's actions. Arthur gently took her hand. "Come on, Mia," he said softly. "Let's go home." Amelia looked one last time at the wreckage of her husband. Julian was standing alone in the center of the room, Isabella having already melted away into the crowd. He was a king in a kingdom that had just vanished, surrounded by people yet utterly, completely alone. She found her voice clear and strong, and it cut through the silence. "No, Julian," she said, looking directly at him. "I'm not going home. I'm just leaving you." And with her head held high, she turned and walked out of the ballroom hand in hand with her father, leaving the gilded cage and its disgraced prince behind forever. The walk out of the plaza was surreal, the same path that Amelia had walked in, on feeling like an imposter she now traversed as a queen, leaving a conquered territory. The whispers that followed her now were not of ridicule, but of awe. The sea of powerful people parted for her and her father, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and a grudging respect. They had just witnessed a public execution of a man they all thought was untouchable, and the quiet woman they had dismissed was at the very center of it. Once outside, the crisp city air felt different. It was the air of freedom. A sleek black unadorned sedan pulled up to the curb, a driver holding the door open. It was not a flashy Rolls-Royce. It was a vehicle of quiet efficiency, much like its owner. As they settled into the plush leather seats, the silence between Amelia and her father was comfortable, not strained. The city lights blurred past the window as the car moved smoothly into the flow of traffic. "You have questions?" Arthur said, finally breaking the silence. Amelia turned to look at him. Really look at him. "Dad, a private equity behemoth, the Sterling Fund." She shook her head in disbelief. "All these years I thought you were a retired professor who managed his investments well." Arthur smiled faintly. "I was a history professor. It was my passion, but I was also good with patterns. History, economics. They're all about patterns. I made some early investments in technology in the 80s. One thing led to another. I never told you the scale of it, because I never wanted it to define you. I wanted you to find your own way, build your own success value, your own worth, without the shadow of a fortune hanging over you. I wanted you to be Mia, the brilliant artist, not Amelia Sterling, the heiress." Tears welled in Amelia's eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude. All the things she loved about her simple upbringing, the focus on education integrity and character over wealth, had been a deliberate, loving choice made by her father to protect her. "How did you know to come tonight?" she asked. "I have a man who keeps an eye on the family's interests." "That includes you," he explained. "He alerted me weeks ago that Julian was getting too close to Isabella Croft, a known shark from a rival firm. I started digging. When I found out what she was doing, I planned to handle it quietly to extract you from the marriage without destroying the company you indirectly owned. But then my man called me tonight. He was at the gala. He told me how Julian was treating you. He described the scene, and that changed everything. No company, no investment is more important than you. I decided it was time to stop being a silent partner." They drove the rest of the way in a comfortable silence, arriving not at the cold, minimalist penthouse she shared with Julian, but at a warm, elegant brownstone on the Upper West Side, a property Arthur had owned for years. The next morning, Amelia woke up in a sun-drenched guest room, that felt more like home than her marital apartment ever had. The news was already breaking. Financial news outlets were in a frenzy about the bombshell revelations at the Blackwood Gala. Blackwood CEO faces outer amid corporate espionage scandal, screamed one headline. Secret billionaire Arthur Sterling revealed as power behind Blackwood Industries, shouted another. Julian was ruined. Isabella Croft and her boss had been suspended, and federal investigators were already involved. Amelia ignored the news. She walked downstairs to find her father in a sunlit library, reading a book, a simple mug of coffee in his hand. He looked up and smiled. "I took the liberty of having some things moved from your studio," he said, gesturing to a corner of the room. There, leaning against the bookshelves, were her canvases, her easels, her boxes of paints and brushes. They looked a little dusty, a little neglected, but they were there. They were her. A wave of emotion washed over Amelia. For 5 years she had felt lost, a pale imitation of herself. Now, in the wreckage of her old life, she felt a profound sense of clarity. She was not Mrs. Julian Blackwood the socialite. She was not a victim. She was Amelia Sterling, an artist, a daughter, a woman who had been through fire and had come out stronger. She walked over to a blank canvas, her fingers tracing its smooth, promising surface. She looked at her father, her heart full. "I think," she said, a real, genuine smile spreading across her face for the first time in years, "I'll paint a sunrise." She was no longer living in the shadow of Julian's world. She was stepping into the light of her own, ready to create a masterpiece that was entirely hers. The life in the gilded cage was over, and the door was wide open to a future she would paint herself. 3 weeks had passed since the night the Blackwood empire crumbled. The media storm, once a raging hurricane, had subsided into a steady, drizzling rain of gossip columns, and where are they now? Pieces. Julian had vanished from the public eye, reportedly holed up in a rented Connecticut cottage, his assets frozen and his reputation in tatters. Isabella Croft, facing a litany of federal charges, had been released on a multi-million-dollar bond, her icy composure famously cracking for the paparazzi as she exited the courthouse. For the world, it was a riveting drama. For Amelia, it was noise she was learning to tune out. Her world had shrunk beautifully and purposefully to the sun-drenched rooms of her father's brownstone, and more specifically, to the corner of the library he had turned into her sanctuary. This is where she began her reclamation. Her first act was to paint the sunrise she had promised herself. For 3 days she worked feverishly, not from a photograph, but from the memory of 1,000 sunrises she had watched from her childhood bedroom window upstate. She mixed vibrant oranges and soft pinks with the deep, lingering purples of the night, capturing the precise moment of transition, the triumph of light over darkness. When she was finished, she didn't feel elation, but a quiet, profound sense of peace. She had taken back the dawn. Her days found a new rhythm dictated not by a social calendar, but by the light. She rose early, drank coffee with her father as they read in comfortable silence, and then she would paint. She painted with an urgency she hadn't felt in years, as if she were trying to make up for lost time. The canvases began to fill up, each one, a piece of her soul being laid bare. One afternoon, her father's lawyer, a sharp, empathetic woman named Evelyn Reed, came to the brownstone to discuss the divorce. Amelia met with her in the formal sitting room, a place she rarely used, feeling a strange sense of detachment as they discussed the end of her marriage. "Julian is attempting to contest the prenuptial agreement," Evelyn said, her tone clinical. "He's claiming duress, and is demanding half of the assets plus lifetime alimony. Amelia felt a flicker of the old anger, but it was distant like an echo. On what grounds? Evelyn offered a thin, wry smile. The grounds of utter desperation. He's arguing that he was unaware of the true scale of your family's wealth and was therefore manipulated into the agreement. It's a ludicrous claim. Legally, it won't hold up for a second, especially given that the assets he's trying to claim are the very ones my other client. She nodded towards Arthur's study. Is in the process of stripping from him. Frankly, Julian doesn't have the money to sustain a lengthy court battle. So what happens? Amelia asked. We file a countersuit for dissolution based on infidelity and emotional cruelty. We present our evidence, and trust me, the evidence of his affair and his public behavior is overwhelming. He'll be forced to accept the original terms of the prenup. He'll walk away with the small personal trust his grandfather left him, and nothing more. He brought this on himself, Amelia. All you need to do is sign the papers. And that was it. The great Julian Blackwood, the master of the universe, was reduced to a desperate legal Hail Mary. The power he had wielded over her, the financial and social dominance he had used to belittle her, was an illusion. She signed the documents with a steady hand, the stroke of the pen feeling less like an ending and more like a beginning. A week later, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived, addressed to her in Julian's familiar, arrogant script. Her first instinct was to throw it away unopened, but she knew she needed to face this last ghost. She took it to her studio, sat down amongst her paintings, and read it. It was exactly what she expected. 12 pages of self-pity blame and manipulative nostalgia. He wrote of their early days, painting her as his muse, his saving grace. He blamed Isabella, calling her a siren who had lured him to his ruin. He blamed her father, accusing him of being a cruel puppet master who had set him up to fail. He never once used the words, "I'm sorry." He ended with a plea for her to meet him, to talk, to remember the love we shared before all this ugliness. She read it through, once her expression unreadable. The woman of a month ago would have wept. She would have felt the pull of his words, the phantom ache of the good memories he so expertly invoked. But the woman sitting there now, surrounded by her truth, by the vibrant colors of her reclaimed soul, felt nothing but a quiet, clinical pity. He was a man-child, incapable of seeing beyond his own reflection. His letter wasn't about love. It was about loss, the loss of his status, his money, his power. She was just another asset he was trying to reclaim. Without ceremony, she walked to the fireplace in the library, struck a match, and held the corner of the first page to the flame. She watched as his looping signature curled into black ash, the fire consuming his empty words, until nothing was left. That evening, her father found her in the studio, standing before a new, massive canvas. It was unlike anything else she had painted. It was a chaotic, abstract piece, filled with jagged lines, dark, bruised colors, clashing violently with streaks of brilliant, blinding gold. It was unsettling and raw, but it was also undeniably powerful. "What's this one called?" Arthur asked softly, studying the canvas. Amelia wiped a smudge of black paint from her cheek, a genuine smile touching her lips. "I'm calling it the Gala," she said. "I think it's finished. It was all there, the confusion, the humiliation, the fury, the shattering of the gilded cage. By painting it, she had taken the ugliest night of her life and transformed it into art." She had taken control of the narrative. Arthur put a comforting arm around her shoulders. "Your first solo exhibition is confirmed for the spring," he said. The gallery owner was ecstatic when she saw the photos of your new work. She said there was a fire and your older pieces were missing. Amelia leaned her head against her father's shoulder, looking at the collection of canvases that now filled the room. There was the sunrise, a symbol of hope. There were landscapes from her memory, a reclamation of her past. And there was the gala, a testament to her survival. It was a portrait of her life in all its pain and all its beauty. The cage was gone, and in its place was an open sky as vast and as full of promise as a fresh blank canvas. And so Amelia Blackwood's story isn't just about the spectacular fall of a narcissistic husband. It's a powerful reminder that our true worth is never defined by the labels others give us, not by a husband, a brand name, or the size of a bank account. It's about the strength we find when we are pushed to our limits, the unexpected heroes who have our backs, and the courage to reclaim the person we were always meant to be. Amelia had to lose everything she thought she wanted to finally gain everything she truly needed: her freedom, her passion, and herself. Have you ever witnessed someone underestimate the quiet ones in the room? Or have you seen a bully get their perfect karmic justice? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If this story of resilience and righteous revenge resonated with you, please give this video a like, share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Click that notification bell so you never miss a single story. Thank you for listening.